can kick everything up. Okay, great. Awesome. So we are live on YouTube.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. We are just let's see. Yeah, I'm just gonna wait one more minute or so until we're right at 7:30, just so we can have a few more people here. But for everybody watching on YouTube, super appreciate you being here. A reminder, our website has a ton of great information, including the current draft of the vision statement, goals and objectives, and all the public input, all the raw input from round one of public workshops and survey, round two of public workshops and survey, and yeah, just lots of good background information about the project. Okay, so we're just going to pause for just another minute and then we'll get going. So thanks for your patience.
Hi, Katie. This is Jan Hennison.
Hi, thanks for being here.
I'm going to keep my video off. I'm feeling pretty under the weather, but I'm here. I'm happy to participate. I'm just going to have my video off.
Okay, thanks for giving us a heads up.
Yep.
Okay, so it's 7:30. I will go ahead. Let's see. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and start. So officially, welcome everybody to tonight's steering committee meeting. This meeting is functioning as meeting number 2 of the zoning subcommittee. So as a reminder, the ultimate goal for this subcommittee is to help limit the total rounds of revisions that are required for the draft zoning code updates. We're doing this here before the zoning code draft updates are ready for public review and town board review. And this is meant to help streamline the process and help keep us on timeline and on budget. So the goal for tonight is to review the first batch of recommended updates to the zoning code with one big objective. The zoning code updates need to be aligned with the draft comprehensive plan vision statement, goals, and objectives. So at the end of tonight's meeting, we'll review the timeline for the additional batches of updates that are still to come, as well as the timeline for public input and town board review. So leading up to tonight's meeting, the full town board, as well as the group here on tonight's call, reviewed these recommendations. They were shared from the comprehensive planning consultant, MPV. Valerie's here representing that team tonight. And we all understand that we are reviewing with an eye towards 2 things. So first, consistency with the draft vision statement, goals and objectives. And number 2, practical implementation and efficiency. So with regards to practical implementation, this subcommittee includes the various delegated boards and councils that actually implement the zoning code on a day-to-day ongoing basis. So we expect members will be able to make suggestions and ask questions that help MPV further refine their recommendations. Okay, so turning our attention to the content of tonight's meeting, I'm going to circle back to this in a second. Yeah, I'm going to circle back to this in a second. Before I do, I just want to say, so we have a ton of stuff to get through tonight. So I'm going to be really strict with watching the clock and making sure that we move our discussion along. So if I stop you in the middle of a comment or ask you to hold a comment, please know it's nothing personal. And please make a note of any questions that don't get answered during tonight's meeting, and then follow up with me after the meeting to let me know if it was still on your mind that we didn't get to address tonight. Okay, so with that, I want to turn our attention to the content of tonight's meeting. So the changes that NPV has proposed to the zoning code are based on and grounded in the public input and feedback that NPV has collected during round 1 and round 2 of the public workshops and their associated surveys. So each of the changes we are discussing that NPV drafted for us, each of these changes is directly related to one of the draft goals and objectives for the comprehensive plan. So let's take a minute to review which of the goals and objectives we will be working with tonight. And for that, I'm going to share my screen. Just a second, here it comes. Okay, so the first item we're looking at, amend as needed inconsistencies in the zoning chapter where appropriate. That's goal number 2, objective 2. Goal number 2, objective 3, review permitted special permit and accessory uses. And then we move down to goal number 6, objective number 5, explore the adoption and definitions for net lot area and environmental constraints, and as they apply to the bulk regulations in the zoning chapter. And then goal number 7, objective 1, review, clarify, and strengthen where necessary, water courses and wetlands and water courses. Chapter 217, 271, wetlands and steep slopes, 220-21. And I believe one more, objective number 7, goal number 7 rather, objective number 2, consider reviewing and strengthening where necessary enforcement mechanisms for the local environmental codes. So the reason why I highlight those, and you can see we still have a long list of other goals and objectives that are going to be addressed at future meetings. But the reason why I highlight those tonight is because the public through round 1 and round 2 has looked at those goals and objectives, and there's broad support for them. The town board has reviewed and discussed them. All of the boards you all represent has reviewed them and discussed them. So that's our mandate. That's what we're looking to do. That's what we're looking to align the zoning code with. Okay, so I'm just going to pause there for a second before we actually dive into the content. Does anybody have any questions on what we just said? And just to keep us moving, we do need to raise hands and sort of be orderly like that when we want to make comments. Okay, Jan, go ahead.
Okay, I thought we only got like 4, maybe 3 sections, and we just talked about a lot more. I don't remember seeing all those different chapters as part of it.
So
no, maybe so that is
what I was just
we didn't get them.
What I was just going through was the column. If you're looking at your screen, the column on the left, just the goals and objectives. There's lots and lots and lots of different sections, but I just wanted to highlight the goals and objectives we're talking about tonight. So we just got one batch. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. I think one of the things, though, actually, as I looked at that, there were a lot more sections that seemed to say completed on them. And I thought we saw the ones that say, you know, we had, I think, 4 sections that we've looked at definitions, or maybe 3 sections, steep slopes and something else. So a lot of these say completed, and I don't remember.
that's because we're not rewriting the zoning, right? We're just reviewing. So part of the first, before we first met, Katie asked me specifically to go through the whole entire zoning code and identify the sections that we're going to look at while we look at the while we work towards updating the zoning. So she specifically asked that we develop a table that we identified each and every section we're going to look at, not necessarily at that point in time where there are sections that we are definitely going to update.
I think that helps clarify it. Charlene? Oh, you're on mute.
I was on the impression that we were only going through 3 sections, and it seems like what you're saying, we're going through more sections.
Okay, sorry. I'm so sorry for creating confusion, everybody. I wanted to highlight the goals and objectives we're talking about tonight, but we are only going to be looking at the things that you
Okay,
had in our Google folder, and that I'll show you right here. That's the definitions and word uses, wetlands and steep slopes, and then wetlands and water courses. That's
okay.
what we're
Okay,
talking about
great.
tonight. Sorry, the goal of my showing this was to show, as Valerie noted, I asked her and her team to put this together specifically so that it would be clear to everybody what the connection is between the objectives and then the corresponding code. That may be a failed exercise, but I really want to ground us in this idea. What we're doing is aligning the code with the goals, the draft goals and objectives. And the draft goals and objectives have been built off of our process of public input. That was really the message I was going for. Okay, any other questions? Okay, great. So with that, let's move into our first agenda items. Why don't we start with the definitions and word usage document? So what I did was I went through the document and highlighted in green everything that we definitely want to talk about tonight. Some of these are just pretty small things we can move through quickly. Some of them might require a little bit of discussion. So we'll just dive right into it. So definitions and word usage. And a reminder, what we're looking at primarily are the changes suggested by NPV. We're also looking at comments that were submitted from this subcommittee. So I'll try to highlight where there's differences here. So quick question here. Is there a difference between the town development plan and the comprehensive plan? And do we need to adjust accordingly? Do you know the answer to that, Valerie, or is that something we need to look into further?
So I think the short answer will be that it's most likely that that it's going to involve the comprehensive plan itself. But that's something that we might want to just double check on, but I think it's going to be the comprehensive plan.
Okay.
So we might want to flag that for potential edits.
Okay.
I agree. I think that's what it means. Town development plan.
As do I. Yeah.
Great. John, do you have a question on that?
Oh, the two guys in the room that would know the answer just answered it, so.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Let's move on, and I'm just gonna.
I'm sorry, so should we edit it right here, or how are we gonna do this?
Okay, this meeting is recorded, so that's
Okay, got it.
I'm gonna ask Valerie. I took the reins to kind of lead the meeting, so Valerie is freed up to take notes. So Valerie, you're good. You're taking notes in the background. All right.
Taking notes.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
All right, let's keep this show moving. Okay, so accessory apartment and accessory residence dwelling.
Yes. So
yeah. Go ahead.
So this one we're not touching yet. That's coming up. We are looking at your zoning, and that was a question that I actually have for the end of this conversation.
Okay.
Because you have two different things in your zoning, and one deals with accessory residence dwelling and one deals with accessory apartments. And they technically have two different sets of regulations associated with them as well. So I wanted to get a little bit more sense on get some more information on your accessory apartments. So I wanted to just kind of chat about that at the end of the meeting this evening.
Okay, so let's flag that and circle back to it at a later conversation. Okay, here there were some questions around fruit, wine, cider being made of grapes, apples, plums, etc. Does anyone have a problem with us just changing that to the word processing of fruit more generally? there like a technical reason why we shouldn't do that, Valerie?
No, I
That's
just did
fine.
not flag this one because one of the things that we looked at were, do you have definitions for like all your uses within the zoning, district? I mean, excuse me, the zoning chapter. And we also looked at, if there are more modern definitions with some of the definitions that you have in place. So accessory winery is clearly an accessory use. It was already defined. Wasn't anything that came up during the public comment. So I just left that it is, but we can change it to processing of fruit if you prefer.
As long as it doesn't materially impact anything drastically, it just makes it a little bit more flexible and clear.
I added this because I thought that the one winery that has been in front of us as an accessory winery had also talked about potential for apples. And so when I see cider, you don't make cider out of grapes, I don't think. So I just was trying to clean it up while we were looking at it. So if you say fruits, I think that's okay, as long as Judd says we're not doing damage to anything.
Yeah. Any objections?
None.
Okay, cool. All right. So next, when you see the red here, these are changes suggested by NPV, by Valerie and her team, but there weren't any comments flagging any concerns from anyone here or from the town board. So in that case, I'll just keep moving on.
Oh, that is just a typo there.
Yeah, I'm gonna skip over stuff with typos, and that I think we can all agree if we see a typo, we want to change it. More edits from MPV that everybody is okay with. This one is gonna go.
And just to clarify, the ones that we're suggesting to remove is that some of these are not even in your zoning chapter at this point.
Great. Here, okay, here's green. Okay, we had a couple statements here. Should service station be expanded to include the provision of EV accessories, amenities, or definitions of standalone EV charging stations? Actually, now I'm saying this out loud. I think, Valerie, this was something you flagged that you wanted to come back to at the end of the conversation with some questions.
Yes, this is another one that, again, this was the alternative energies are going to be dealt with, I think, in either October or November, where we're going to talk about battery energy storage, solar. And so EV charging stations are going to be something that we are going to incorporate into your zoning. But I think that's a question I want to talk to the group about at the end on how they're being handled currently. And because in many communities, they're just within a parking space and there's not even something that's not even an issue or it doesn't need to be defined or even part of a zoning chapter. But I want to see, what this group has been doing with EV charging stations.
Okay, so
I do have one small question though. If I have a electric car and I need brake work done, do I go? I'm kind of thinking that maybe we just want to change the name to vehicle service station.
Well, I think the difference is, I mean, we can change it to vehicles.
Let's pause this. I think this is part of a bigger conversation. So let's circle back to it at the end.
Right, because I think my point is we can change this at some point to a vehicle service station. The issue is the EV charging, I think, should be separate, right? Because if you say EV charging is specifically associated with a gasoline service station, then you're potentially boxing yourself in a situation where only in your business districts that allow for, service stations can you have an EV charging station. And that is not the way most communities are moving forward with EV charging.
Got it.
Yeah, part of a bigger conversation, I think. So I saw a hand go up, but I think we'll wait till the end to talk about that. That's okay? Or do you have something quick?
Yeah, we don't allow gasoline service stations anymore.
Okay, well,
existing. So I'm just bringing that up.
That's no new ones, but
new ones, right?
But if, again, all I was trying to do is maybe change the title technically from gasoline to vehicle, just so,
Yeah, but if we do that, then we won't allow any EV stations.
So Charlene, when you say you don't allow it, I didn't see it in in the zoning chapter that says you're not allowed to build any new ones.
we have a moratorium. There's a code somewhere. There's a code that was, it might be one of the new laws that didn't make it into the book yet.
Yep.
That's true.
Okay.
I just wanted to make everybody aware, and you're right, we can talk about it later, but keep it in mind.
Okay, let's move on. John, I see is that about this or?
Yeah, just at the point, we already have a set of EV chargers, and they're not the same as a service station. All they are is spots where you can pull up, and so they are different.
Exactly.
Distinct.
Okay, cool. So let's table that for now. It's bigger conversation we got to come back to later. Valerie's taking a note of that. Okay, there were a couple of questions here on housekeeping facilities. Charlene, so a slop sink or plumbing in a barn or garage is okay. So Valerie, maybe you can just clarify this and we can think of a way to make the language really clear.
So this is your existing.
Mhm.
You know, we can clarify it, or we can add, you know, right now, I haven't heard anything, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Lewisboro has an issue with illegal housing or illegal apartments or illegal, right? So that's usually when communities will start really tightening the definitions of housekeeping facilities so that they can potentially issue violations in terms of those types of uses. So right now, when it's showing it, you have on there any evidence of a sink, you know, stove or any combination unit containing a sink, stove, and refrigerator. That's typical for considering something that would be identified as potentially housekeeping facilities. Because in other communities or in other situations, you will find somebody trying to have a hot plate, and you know, and they'll have like a mini fridge, or they'll have like some sort of combination and claim it's not a housekeeping facility, right? And when in fact they are utilizing it as, you know, as the same. So this just helps to identify what it is that you're saying is a housekeeping facility.
Got it. Having the context for why this is even mentioned is helpful.
Yes.
So thank you. I think that helps. And I don't have a problem with the wording.
Does that answer your question, Charlene?
Not really, because plumbing in place for a sink can be considered.
Yes. So I think, right. So I think this provides a little flexibility for your code enforcement, right? If you want to remove the plumbing in place for sink can be considered evidence of housekeeping facilities, you're just reducing the flexibility that your code enforcement officer could potentially issue a violation if they go into a situation where they see certain, like for example, plumbing in place, but not necessarily a sink, but they see a refrigerator and they also see a stove, that they could issue it as you know, a housekeeping facility, or it's being considered a housekeeping facility.
Oh, okay. So it's the can instead of the shall.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so we're good with that?
Yep.
Okay. Super interesting. Okay, transient for parking space, just transient basis, a little clarification on that.
Well, I think it just means that it typically doesn't mean that it's a permanent. You know, again, we could probably remove that from the definition. I think when we reviewed that definition, we didn't really find it problematic, but if you would like to make it a little bit more clear, we can remove that. I don't think it's going to be substantial one way or the other.
Okay, there wasn't any public feedback that would indicate that.
No, there was
And
not. We can remove on a transient basis if you'd like.
And on-street parking is something separate?
Well, on street, so this is going to be, again, this is referring to your zoning. So your zoning chapter refers to parking spaces, and probably in terms of, you know, when you get to your parking requirements. So it's different than on-street spaces. So this is really, these definitions really tie to other regulations and provisions in your zoning chapter. And so when you see these terms in those regulations and provisions, then you can refer back to the zoning definition. So as we go through the other sections, if for some reason we see, when we look at your parking regulations, if we see that somehow parking spaces being utilized differently and we need to come back and change and amend that definition, we can.
Okay, that's fine. I'm just in my head, I already know of, one situation where like the on-street and off-street combined is sort of enmeshed in an issue. So, but that's.
Yeah, well, that might be outside of zoning. It could also be just something in terms of other regulations. I would have to know the details before.
Sure. Okay.
So I actually, now I'm coming back to like that on a transient basis, now that I'm thinking about how this goes, because, if somebody, I don't know, if somebody decides they want to have, anyway, I'm okay with
Yeah,
leaving it as
It's
it is.
flexible.
But
Okay.
Just
All
in
right.
the saving time, sorry.
Okay.
Keep it.
Good to make that. Okay. Ranching animal farm, does that relate to breeding of cats and dogs? I don't know how often that happens in Lewisboro, but it could.
And I didn't know if it covered kennels. We have it, but we have a separate thing for kennels. But yeah, there are people who breed cats and dogs, but I don't, and I think we have a 5-dog limit. So I don't know. It was more a matter of interest. We can just move on. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Okay, we're almost done with this one.
Oh, there was a scroll up for a second. There was a question,
I think
considering short-term rentals. I think that was something that was decided by the town board for right now. We're going to hold off on dealing with any of that.
And we can flag that for a later discussion as well, if necessary. But we haven't received any direction from the town board about what if they would like us to do anything in that arena. Okay, street. Is private roads, is that something that we need to discuss at all, or?
So private roads are typically a separate definition than a street. This is actually a mapped street on a subdivision versus a private road is just one that's not a mapped street, that's not going to be basically maintained by the town. So it would be a separate definition, and some of the questions you're raising are outside of, like, I'm going to say the zoning chapter would be more dealing with like what actual like map streets and stuff, dealing with more like New York State town law.
Charlene?
I'm sorry, I remember looking at the family definition, and I just want to check with Valerie that that's valid and has been litigated.
So if you scroll up, we did make a suggestion. I think we made a suggestion on the family definition.
Yes,
but
you did. And I have no problem with it, but I just want to know if that's been litigated.
So the one that has been successfully litigated is much larger and more detailed. But I did not decide to bring that in because I didn't feel like that was something that was. I did not hear that as an issue in the town of Lewisboro, but what I did do was you had specifically a group of related individuals, and there's been court cases that have basically said it's not necessarily related, but it can be like legal adoption. So it's a little bit more clarifying, and you had not more than 4 unrelated individuals, and so again, I was just defining that a little bit more, how it's not related by blood, marriage, or legal adoption, occupying a dwelling unit and living and cooking is the same as a single housekeeping unit.
But I think we should sort of earmark it for review of the attorneys, because, you don't want to put something in that is going to be litigated right away.
Yes, I will say this is a little bit slightly tighter than you had originally.
Right, yeah.
But they're like for example, the city of Poughkeepsie actually had their definition litigated and they won, and it is quite lengthy. So it's something that, you know, the town can consider adopting. It just, I'll defer to your attorneys as to whether that's really an issue and that needs to be
Yeah,
done.
I'm not, yeah,
Okay.
that's the comment.
We will flag that and
Thank
come
you.
back to it. Well, we'll have Valerie's going to write down that that's going on the attorney list. Okay, so we were here. I think I'm going to skip over stuff that's yellow for now. Telecommunications.
So this really deals with the telecommunications regulations that you have, which most communities adopted when the FAA, you know, required adoption. So, you know, to start tweaking with those, I just I feel like those regulations are really kind of specialized. And this really doesn't deal with like your uses, but it really deals with your telecom regulations that somehow, for a lot of communities, have it as a separate chapter. You have it directly embedded in your zoning chapter.
And those chapters use the word radio.
Well, I mean,
or we can flag that to come back. Let's flag that to review when we look at those chapters specifically.
well, so that I'm not, so we typically, because FAA and the federal government regulates like this very, very like, there's a lot of regulations and a lot of things that the towns cannot regulate associated with telecommunications. So a lot of times, you know, communities have certain regulations on the books, but for the most part, you know, they can regulate in terms of like certain supply. You know, so for example, that you would have to petition to say you already have like, there's not a gap and you already have an abundant supply in a particular area. But other than that, there's not much regulations that can take place in terms of what towns can control. There's a little bit on the aesthetics, but very, very little. So if we're going to start tweaking with some of your telecommunications requirements, that's something that you're definitely going to want to get an attorney on, because you don't want a situation where you overstep your boundaries based upon what's already been you know, determined by the federal government.
Okay, John, you put your hand.
Yeah, I
down.
think radio seems like an old term. I think wireless fits better unless there's a legal reason to have radio.
Why wouldn't it include also fiber or, you know, any number of teles means far, right? So,
Okay, Charlene, what were you going to say?
Is there a definition, federal FCC definition for telecommunications? Because it's a definition.
Right. I mean, I can take a look. The biggest issue, this really deals with your wireless communications. It deals with your cell towers. This is like, these are the regulations that have kind of been put into place. So I can take a look to see if there's
A general, yeah,
a
just
different definition. I just don't, you know, then we'd have to, I think the biggest issue is we have to take a look at how that affects the telecommunications. I mean, that's a whole nother, usually there's typically somebody that's very specialized in that. You know,
Okay.
I don't even know like that. I mean, I think the issue is, I don't even know if that's really an issue that we need to be, that the town, I mean, that this committee needs to be focused on in terms of your telecommunications laws. I mean,
Okay, let's pause
that-
here.
yeah.
We're talking about word usage and we're kind of getting into the weeds here.
Yeah, I'd mark it. I think that's an outmoded definition. I think it needs to align. The telecom provisions in the zoning code have kind of developed over time and we've tried to keep up. I think they need to be looked at just to be kind of streamlined. But my 2 cents, radio is probably the wrong word, and just mark it and we can come back to it.
Okay, there's some further research and discussion that has to happen. I think we can move on from that. We need to keep the pace going here. Let me find my next screen. Okay, we made it to the end of definitions, so that's good. Yeah, so definitely stuff that needs to be revisited, but the definitions are going to be relevant through all of our conversations as we're going on through our future batches. So I think
Yes, and so they'll be revisited absolutely as we go through and as we look at some of the,
And this gives you and your team, Valerie, direction on just, we're being detail oriented. We want to make sure everything is streamlined, but basically all of your team's changes that you proposed, nobody had any issues with. So,
right. And what on the couple things is I can reach out to Judson, if that's all right, directly and send him some definitions on family. And then get his thoughts on that.
Fine. Yep.
Okay, great. All right, so let's pause and take a breath. We made it through definitions. I'm just going to bring up the agenda here. So before we head into wetlands, I want to just flag that Valerie and Jan, who's the town's wetlands consultant, happened to bump into each other on a site visit that was for another town, I assume, Valerie. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, for another town, something unrelated, and they were chatting. It turns out that back in 2016, 2017, there had been some work done on a proposed set of changes to the wetlands law that didn't go through. And this is the first that it has come up in this whole public input process. Valerie and her team didn't hear about it from the public, from any of the boards or committees or councils. So hearing about it now does not throw a wrench into the gears of all the work that Valerie and her team have already done based on our very detailed public input process. However, there are some nuggets in there that were drafted by the legal team and the planning board, I think just the legal team at the time, that are administrative only, that talk about how the process is implemented. So we can potentially mine those for some good updates. And when we're going to go through the wetlands stuff tonight, and you'll see there are a couple questions from the planning board, from Jan, from Rose, from Kirsten, just on like, wait, but in practice, we actually do this and this says this. So where we have opportunities to clean things up and actually make the documents represent the reality of how things are run right now, I think that's a great opportunity to fall under that second category of ease of implementation and streamlining. But so I just want to ground that there. But other than that, we're not going to go back and look at this draft proposed law that we wouldn't have known about otherwise. Does that seem fair to everybody? I see some nodding heads. Okay, great. I don't think we need to take more time on that. So we're going to dive into those codes right now and go through them. Again, we're going to follow that color coding system. When you see red changes, that's NPV. And this one is very short. You'll see it's only 2 pages. So on the first page, I saw Jan's question and I too was a little confused. I chatted with Valerie about it very quickly this morning. So I'm just going to paraphrase what I heard her say. Valerie, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Right now, there's these 2 separate documents. You got number 3 and number 4. And 4 is all about wetlands and water courses. Number 3 really is just about steep slopes, but it makes sense right now. There's a little bit more detail, but what her and her team are proposing changing this to is that A1 is just, hey, if you want to know more about wetlands and water courses regulations, see the other code over there. That's basically summarizing it. Do we think we need to change the title so that this is just steep slopes? Or is there a reason, logistically speaking, to keep wetlands in this? Valerie?
So we only kept it in there is because you actually have the section right now in your zoning says wetlands and steep slopes. But what we noticed is that it actually started bringing in certain regulations and then it referred to the law. And so we felt that it would just make it, it just makes sense. It just refers to the law and it doesn't include any sort of provisions. That being said, you could just remove it and just have a steep slope section if you'd like. But sometimes, communities like to also highlight, so that nobody's, missing particular regulations within the town code itself, and they would say, you know, you have to adhere to the all wetlands regulations. So that's a preference for the town. It's not necessarily something you have to do one way or the other.
Okay, then let's pause that, put a pin in it. We can always come back to it later. But I think the idea of just this deals with steep slopes. If you want to know more about wetlands, refer to separate. I think that makes sense. Everybody's nodding. Some people are nodding. Okay. So then we get into a question here. Valerie, do you kind of want to summarize what your team did with adding in these 3 different levels, like 15, 25, 35?
Yeah,
And
so why don't you scroll up for a second? So you just had originally in your zoning chapter, you just had hilltops, ridge lines, and steep slopes. And specifically, I have the original language here, but specifically you just have, it is in general, it is the purpose of this chapter to preserve all hilltops, ridge lines, and steep slopes. And towards this end, wherever possible, new construction shall avoid such areas, and existing vegetation in such areas shall not be disturbed. And then you had the town board, planning board, and zoning board of appeals and building inspector shall take this objective into consideration in reviewing and acting on any plans. And then you had, for the purpose of this chapter, steep slopes shall be considered to be those areas with slopes of greater than 15%. And we felt that one of the goals and objectives was to look at all your environmental regulations and to see where things might not necessarily be, you know, where they could be tightened in terms of bringing it up to best practices or you know, what you see in other communities. And so one of the things that we noted was that we felt that there should be some certain categories of steep slopes, and, you know, it was a little too broad in terms of, like, you know, try to avoid, and then it doesn't really, you know, provide much in terms of actual requirements or preservation. So what we suggested doing, typically there's like 3 different, a lot of times there's 3 different categories of steep slopes. You know, there's moderately steep slopes, there's very steep slopes, and extremely steep slopes. And that's how we just define those. You know, they can be defined in many different ways. In other communities, you just have 2 different categories, but we decided 3 different categories. And what we're suggesting here, and if you scroll up, Katie, and what we're suggesting here is that in terms of hilltops, ridgelines, and moderately and very steep slopes, that they shall be preserved along with existing vegetation wherever possible. But then we have another category where we're basically saying new constructions or additions shall be avoided as practical as possible in areas with moderately and in moderately and very steep slopes. So this is just saying you avoid as practical as possible. The next one is new construction and existing vegetation removal shall be prohibited in areas with extremely steep slopes unless otherwise permitted by the approving board as follows. And then it talks a little bit about justifications that they have to make and that you have to make. So that's what we're proposing, so that, you know, it does kind of require that additional step in order to allow for development on your extremely steep slope areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Janet, why don't you ask your question?
Sure. So I think what you've done is great here, Valerie, in that I really think we do need a little bit more than, try to avoid it. So I think we do need some rules, but I would rather see the rules apply to very steep slope and say you have to come in for, you know, a approving body. And my reason is that I've never seen really maps or anything that tells you have a 35% slope. So I don't know how people would know that. Whereas and 25% steep slope seems to me to be steep enough to really, you know, deserve some more regulations than do your best. So that was my only, so I have a question about how people know where 35% is.
So I think typically when you undertake any sort of construction, you have an architect or an engineer they're the ones that will do those kind of analyses. You as like as a homeowner wouldn't necessarily have to do that work. So if you're coming to the planning board for certain approvals, that's when those calculations would be undertaken.
John? You're on mute.
Yeah, but not everything comes to the planning board, so it's something that has to probably initially seen by the building inspector.
Right, so this is something that's like a larger discussion, and I'll turn it over. I mean, Jan clearly wants to weigh in, but I think that's a larger discussion. Like, how does the town want to deal with the steep slopes, right? Do you want to just focus on things that come before the planning board, or do you want to start regulating all work on steep slopes?
Let's have Jan weigh in.
Yeah, right now, as you noted, the steep slope regulations are kind of aspirational. There's really no teeth to them. There's no steep slopes permits whatsoever. And the only residential projects that come to the planning board is if you need a wetland permit. So I think that if you're looking to regulate steep slopes, and I'm not saying you should or you shouldn't, there would need to be something set up where you're creating another permit and having the planning board or some other board, review these applications, because the planning board's only seeing commercial applications and wetland permits right now. So this would just be viewed at the building department level.
So do we want to maybe move this section and take it out and just move it towards, take this out and then maybe move it towards like your subdivision regulations, right? So if a new subdivision comes in at that point, that gets dealt with, because I think the issue is if you add a permit process, which we can do, but it's another permit process, right? And I don't know if, we were trying to, because you didn't have a permit process in place and you had, like, as Jan said, more aspirational goals, we didn't feel that the very next step should be a full-blown permit process. One, because, yes, you do have some steep slopes. It's not, you're not in like a Rivertown community where most of your community is built on like a steep slope, so you do, so we thought instead of taking that big leap for like an actual permitting process, that we kind of would put it into like having some additional requirements when projects come before the planning board. But if you feel that it wouldn't be as applicable there, we could move it to like maybe your subdivision regulations. So if you do get additional subdivisions coming in, that's something that, it would be taken into consideration at that point in time.
I think that's a town board question, how they want to deal with steep slopes.
That's a policy decision. And if there is a desire, it should be a standalone section of the town code, like wetlands, with its own, permitting provisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would have to be, you can't just say subdivisions, individual lots. We're going to fall under this as well to be consistent. So I agree. It really needs to be a new ordinance, probably.
The other thing I'll just piggyback on that is the town has no regulations on fill. So we've had a couple instances where properties owners are bringing in a tremendous amount of fill onto their properties. There's no regulations to deal with that. So I think that should be looked at as well.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
I thought our objectives were really to make recommendations to the town board, and then they get to decide on it. So I did hear you. Yeah, it's a policy. It's definitely a policy decision by the town board, but I think our role is to make regulations, to make recommendations. And I take the idea about moving it to subdivision, but I also think I think we do need something that says if it's a very steep slope, I was going to say if it's a steep slope, but okay, if we want to say 35% is our target, I think there should be regulations in here for that as well. So when somebody comes in, I don't want to exempt like a commercial property that would come in just because we've now moved it to subdivisions. So
why don't we can put together for next time, like maybe a draft of a steep slopes law, right? And if and we did not get into like, but if excavation and fill, I mean, that is a big issue if you don't have any fill regulations, right? Or excavation regulations, that maybe we might want to consider adding, like also having like a draft of something as well, because if those are situations which are taking place within the town and they really do need to be regulated, that's something that the town board can consider as well.
I think there should be, just because, if it's not in a wetland buffer and it is less than 5,000 square feet of disturbance triggering the stormwater permit, it's just allowable. There's no building department involvement because there's no building permit for fill, and it's completely unregulated.
Okay, I just want to do a concept check here. Valerie, it sounds like you and your team did hear enough feedback from the public relating to this specific issue that there was public support and support from the various boards and councils and committees, I should say. So there's stakeholder support for taking a closer look at steep slopes. That's an accurate statement?
Yes, I mean, we specifically have, we're specifically looking at where possible to help with to avoid some of the environmentally sensitive areas in terms of developing on those. And there's a number of different ways. I mean, in the goals of the comprehensive plan, we said we'll look at like your net lot area. And there is a section that we're going to hit in the zoning chapter that we noticed that there is some calculations or required deductions in terms of in terms of buildable lots. So we will be looking at that. But in addition to that, you have these other things like excavation and fill, and then also steep slopes that your town code is kind of silent to. And and this is part of the reason why we have this zoning subcommittee, is like so Jan can bring up those issues of like, yeah, these things have happened and there's no regulation. So let's create that. And I think, yes, ultimately it's the town board that makes those decisions. But in terms of like some of these excavation and fill permits and steep slopes, I think you're going to find it's few and far between in which how many properties or projects would be affected. But a lot of times those are the types of projects that if for some reason left unchecked can cause a lot of damage within like a community.
Yep.
Okay, so I think we have that we're all on the same page here. That's our function. We need to take the public input, translate it into goals and objectives, and then translate it into actionable code recommendations for the town board. And that's what Valerie and her team are going to do. And I think they have marching orders to take what we've started with here and adjust it a little bit and come back with a new version.
Yeah, we can do that. And then the other thing too is also keep in mind that this is all going to have public hearings in front of the public as well. So they'll also get to weigh in on whatever is proposed.
Absolutely.
Too.
This is step one of a complicated process that we're just trying to streamline the versions. As I mentioned up front, we need to streamline what the town board and the public gets so that there's less revisions, less money, less time. But the town board and the public aren't going to have the input next.
Right. And I'd also be happy to, if ahead of time, if you want me to send what we're proposing for the committee's review to Judson and Jan, just for their initial review and feedback too.
They've had everything.
Okay.
Ahead of time. The full town board, the full committee, Judd, Jan, and Gregory have all had the documents for the.
Oh yeah, no, I just didn't know if you wanted me to have like an initial quick review by Judd first before it then goes to this committee and then the full town board.
I think that's actually a question for them to work out with the town board in terms of their engagement and how they're getting paid for that work.
Okay.
So I'm going to put that if the lawyers and the town board can take that offline and figure that out, then
that can be figured. But for just continue to distribute as you have.
Okay. That's fine.
Quick question, Charlene, before we move on. Oh, you're on mute.
Just asking Dan if he can follow through with the engagement of both Judd and and Jan.
Or loop in the board and
Yeah.
get working on that together.
This is on the steep slopes.
No, in
On-
general, that they're involved in this process and
Oh,
putting in time and hours, and that they just need to make sure they're
sorry.
having
Yeah,
engagement.
because being an attorney, Judd is doing this out of the kindness of his heart right now.
Okay, so let's move on.
That,
Put
that
that
or
on-
what, that or watch the Netflix movie. My wife is watching it, but you know, this is
This is more exciting.
This is
this is more exciting.
Okay,
Poor
so
baby.
let's keep the momentum going. Now we're gonna look at chapter 217, and we've got the same color coding here.
So, Katie, before you begin, I just want to just take a moment. So when we looked at this chapter, right? So again, one of the things that we looked at specifically was really dealing with, you know, do you have, I'm going to say your basic checklist in terms of wetlands regulations, right? So wetlands regulations run the gamut, but there are certain, like, I'm going to say best practices. Do you have buffer areas? So that's the stuff that we looked at right now. Clearly, and we'll see this as we go through some of the comments that came up, you know, there seems to be a disconnect between what's there in your regulations and the actual process that's taking place. And so this is something I think we can rectify. And I think this has come out in the comments that we received on the chapter. And also some of the former edits from Jan. And so this is something that we can talk about, but that's what I just wanted to tell you, like sort of our approach. We were looking at more of the technical stuff, but then in terms of other things that have come up, it's clear that maybe there's other adjustments, and maybe that's some of the issues that were raised that we did hear from the public a little bit in terms of, like, you know, they thought they could do something on the site, or they found the process confusing, or it was like, you know, it took longer than they thought. And maybe this is a way of being able to help clarify those two things as well.
Okay, thanks. I think that's helpful. All right, so I'm just gonna go through, bear with me because there's a lot of pages, but I'm just scrolling through so everybody can see when we hit something green. Okay, so this we don't need to discuss right now in detail, but this is a perfect example of what Valerie was just saying, where there's a disconnect between the words here. And there's some good language from the work that Jan did way back when that we can just pull in, that will save Valerie and her team some time. But that's the kind of example that we're talking about. Like, we just need to make the language in the code match what the language in the actual process is happening. Okay, so I'm gonna skip over the yellow stuff for now and just focus on the green, just in the interest of time.
Well, I do want to talk about the clear cutting thing really
Okay.
quickly, because this is something that came up with the definition of a tree, and, like, you know, so it's in your wetlands regulations, it's also in your zoning chapter, and it's also in your tree preservation chapter. The issue there is in each one of them, they're specifically relating to a different topic area. So one deals with tree preservation, one deals with wetlands, and then one deals with actual, like, site design elements. So, you know, we looked at that, and could you create a definition for trees that, especially dealing with the diameter breast height for all three? Yes. But the issue is, what's the number, right? Because in some situations, it's like 4 inches. In other situations, I think it's like 8 inches. And depending upon, you know, which way you go, you're either capturing a lot more trees or you're capturing fewer trees. And so because of that, you know, I'm going to kind of, I think the real issue is, I don't necessarily know if you want to change those definitions, because I get the sense when looking at those various chapters that there was a reason 4 inches was specifically identified for one chapter versus another chapter. And so that's where I just wanted to kind of have that larger, like, little bit of larger discussion, maybe at the end of, like, after we go through this chapter, as to how you want to deal with the tree thing. I saw it. It's definitely an issue. It would make it easier if they were all lines, but the broader, you know, but then you have to come in with the decision of what diameter breast height are you really looking at?
I think, John, weigh in quickly, but this might be a broader.
No, I think we should be consistent with the tree ordinance for one. And secondly, we're about to change the tree ordinance for clear cutting. So just throwing that out there.
Okay, let's
But
flag
I
this
think-
as
But I
needing
think we
more
should be
back.
consistent. I think we're used 6 inches maybe in the tree ordinance, but I think we should have one number.
Okay, this definitely flag this to come back to later. I don't think we can address this completely tonight. Did Jan, do you?
Yeah,
have
I'm just gonna be quick and say, I do think there's a different reason that we have different ones, but I think one of the things that if we don't make it consistent the way John suggested, I think we have to really identify it and say, for the purposes of this chapter, trees are 4 inches, and make it,
maybe- okay,
bold somewhere.
yeah, point taken. Okay, putting a pin in that, we will definitely circle back to that another time. Okay, so suggestion from Jen here, after material, would it make sense to say from the substrate of a water body so that it refers to water as opposed to land? Is that a helpful point of clarification? Does anybody have a problem with that? Okay.
No.
I think it's helpful just for clarifying the
I
language.
think it makes sense.
Okay, good. I'm gonna skip
Yeah,
over.
so that one, can we go back up to that freshwater wetlands thing? So that was something that was suggested in Jan's revisions to remove entirely. And I think probably for the same reasons that Jan is bringing this issue up in terms of what's really the wetlands map, as opposed to you're just going to regulate if you have wetlands or not on site. So that's something we can look at and address in the next round.
Well, so after tonight's meeting, I'm hoping that Valerie, you and your team will be able to provide just some of the quick changes, and incorporating the administrative streamlining kind of things is one of them. So that would address something like this.
Right, and I see Jan has his
Yeah,
hand
go
raised, so
ahead, Jan.
maybe Jan, you have something to.
Yeah, I would recommend it be removed, and I think because we have the environmental questionnaire clearance form in the code that gets us out to every property to see firsthand whether there's a wetland or not, that this is unnecessary.
Noted. Okay, got it. What do we got here? Okay, permit activity. Does this mean only the town may issue a permit? Just a little clarification here, Valerie.
Right, so this is, and actually, Jan's additions also recommended a change to like wetlands permit, but basically this permit activity is referred to throughout this zoning, throughout this wetlands chapter. So it's actually the type of permit. So what we can do is, because I think I found that a little confusing, but it wasn't so detrimental that we had to say we should shift this. But since we're cleaning up this administrative, basically your activity permit is your wetlands permit, but it's not referred to as a wetlands permit throughout the whole entire chapter. It's just referred to activity permit. And so it might be worthwhile, because it's something that Jan's suggested changes also picked that up and said it should just be a wetlands permit. And that might be also more clear for people when they're reading it, to understand that activity permit is really the wetlands permit.
That sounds great. Nodding heads. Okay, that'll help a lot with clarity. Yeah, because activity permit is pretty big. Okay, excellent. So Jan and John both had a question here about adding noise and or light pollution.
Yeah, so I'm gonna, now Jan, you can hit on this too. But I'm going to say my biggest concern with noise and light pollution is that they're very, very hard to enforce. And because there's one thing I think we can work with your light regulations to make sure that there's no encroachment, right? In terms of when you do site plan review. The difficulty I find is that when I've been dealing with this in another community with dealing with lights on a wetland area. And, you know, it was always, and it's not clearly during the day, it's during the night. And then what considers and what's light pollution versus not light pollution for a wetland area. And it's difficult to enforce because the building inspector would have to go out at night and identify that as a violation for the wetlands permit. So where it's a little bit easier dealing with temperature, odor, color, turbidity, pH, those things are a little bit easier to define. But I mean, Jan, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I agree. To determine the impacts of noise or light on a wetland is very subjective, and I don't think it'll be helpful here.
Jan?
Yeah, we have on lakes, we have a few people, one of whom owned a lighting store. So he had these massive lights that were like you would put on a sports field that were going across the lake so he could see them. So that's the genesis. I understand the difficulty of enforcing it, but maybe, so like you said, maybe it goes into a lighting chapter rather than putting it into a wetland chapter. But I was thinking of adding it just so that if there was something really egregious, it might be something that could be addressed, because otherwise our lighting, as you will find out if you haven't seen already, our lighting chapter isn't particularly strong either. So I was just hoping that we would have a way of at least telling someone, you know, this is not what you should be doing, and hoping that would be okay. But I understand the point. Maybe it shouldn't be in the wetland chapter.
Okay, John?
Yeah, I think that it needs to be addressed in the lighting chapter. There is some regulation about having light shining into another house. The lake is a little different because it may or may not be, but it probably belongs in the lighting chapter. We have a noise ordinance too, so it might be a suggestion that we review both of those.
Okay.
Yeah, both of those are separate kind of species of impacts and should be addressed within the confines of what they are, lighting and noise, rather than trying to shoehorn them into the wetlands code.
Yeah.
But before we leave that, another area that, and maybe it would be covered, we're really concerned as people start doing geothermal, that people will start throwing their geothermal stuff into lakes, because it's you don't have to drill. And I guess that would be covered by temperature changes, but I just want to, again, I don't have an answer, just want to raise it as a potential question as we go forward.
Okay.
So I would assume that would fall under like temperature. You know, I mean, I think, but then again, you're also like, that's a direct, right? So you would be directly depositing into a wetland itself, and so it would be regulated.
No, what you would do is you'd put a pipe in, a closed loop pipe in that would transfer either the heat of the house into the cool of the lake,
Right.
or use the warmth essentially of the lake to warm your house in the winter. So it's like a geothermal thing. So it would change the temperature, but it isn't. It isn't by adding. It's like a geothermal thing. And I've seen this happen on some lakes in central New York where they've had huge debates about it, because there aren't regulations. Again, I don't have an answer, but since we're going through it, I wanted to bring it up as something to think about if we think it's important.
Okay. before I take the additional questions, I realize that despite my best efforts, there's no way we're getting through this by 9 o'clock. So if anybody needs to leave at 9, totally understand, but I think it probably is in our best interest to break my rule about going over and just keep slogging through this. Nodding heads. Yeah, okay. Okay, I hate to do it, but I think it's necessary. Jan, you go first.
I think we could address Jan's concern about when we go through the regulated activities or use. If something like that is not included, we can add it there as opposed to including it in the pollution definition. Because those are just point blank, you need a permit for this, you need a permit for that. So, you know, installation of a pipe in a lake, boom, you need a permit.
Okay, Charlene.
I agree.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, we have to do something because, you know, the comprehensive plan is to look ahead of what we're gonna do in 20 years, and that's gonna be a bigger issue as time goes on.
Okay, so Valerie, can you flag that for Dan?
Yeah, just say, if we do it that way, I would think that the folks adjudicating that would still want some kind of criteria to base their decision on, you know, and Jan's concern about temperature rise. There's also some systems which are not closed loop where there could be other things exhausted. So anyway, put a pin in it, but it looks like some research necessary.
Yeah, so I'd say let's make it prohibited instead of regulated and see.
No, I don't think
Okay,
we want to
let's
go
put
that way.
Put a pin in this.
Yeah.
Moving on.
I don't know if we want to prohibit, right? You don't want to prohibit new technologies. You want to be able to address them. That's, you know.
Yeah, I don't think, I think we've discussed that enough. So we're going to move on, and we've got lots of other things to cover as well. Okay, restoration plan. So here, I think this is like a clarification thing to make it more clear.
Yeah, so that's again another thing that Jan's suggestions were to, instead of where it specifically says planning board, it says approving authority, because there's some that are administrative permits and then there's some that are specifically for the planning board. So this will help, like whatever the approving authority is, will have to undertake some of these efforts. So we'll go through and like update that so that it's a little bit more clear as to who does the final review.
Okay. That'll falls in the administrative category. The selective cutting, I think that falls into, we got to come back to that with all the other tree stuff. I'm gonna skip. Question here, just in terms of effective date of this chapter, is that going to be the new effective date or the original effective date?
This is just going to be amendments. So I don't anticipate it being a full repeal and replace. If it is, then it would be technically the effective date of the new, like the replacement.
Okay, so if we could just make that more clear, that way people reading this understand. Well,
that will technically be that's the term, like, so this is, remember, this is the actual legal, like, this is the actual local law. So the effective date would still be whenever this was adopted, which I believe is like, what, 1990 something. So okay, that's the effective date.
Got it. Okay, we don't, I think. Oh. Okay, so in here, this is a comment from Jan. So this is just making, perhaps adding some language to make it clear that if you're incidentally clearing weeds on your property by hand or trash, that's okay. Whereas right now it's not super clear that is okay.
Yeah, this is out of a wetland. So for example, I mean, I think when I first got involved with this, I realized that if there was a tire sitting in your lakefront, you weren't officially allowed to pull it out. So we need to have something that allows you to do minimally. Now, is anybody ever going to enforce somebody taking junk out of the lake? No, but it would be cleaner to say you can go do some debris removal, some hand pulling of weeds, because people do it all the time, and we might as well recognize it. That's just the thought behind that.
I think we can come back to that at another time. It's probably just make tweaks in the language, but then selective cutting, that potentially,
Right, my concern is aquatic plant material. You know, when do you start, when is it like, you know, I think there's difference between certain plant material that you want to remain within a lake habitat versus ones that you want to remove.
Absolutely, but I think hand pulling maybe is one, but the point you just made, you know, that obviously you've got to, as long as it's not rare, threatened, or, you know, endangered species. Yeah, okay. But I think there ought to be, so people all around lakes will spend time pulling out weeds, you know, in a 5 by 10 foot area so that they can walk into the lake without getting their legs, you know, caught by weeds. I think we ought to recognize that happens, but I understand the difficulty.
does that fall under the category of sort of normal ground maintenance of your lakeside area?
I don't know, I mean, I'll defer to Jan, what your thoughts are on that.
In some ways, but I'll also just add a confusing factor, which is in some cases, it's not clear if you own the water or the land under the water, if the state owns the land under the water, if somebody else does. So this is a bigger topic, but I'm just gonna, and I see Jan went unmuted, so I'll shut up.
Yeah, I don't think it falls under one. I'm not opposed to adding something that allows some minimal removal of aquatic vegetation for maintenance purposes in front of a lakefront. But that terminology would have to get worked out.
Okay, let's work on that for later. And then the selective cutting, does that relate to the broader tree discussion, or is that just the language issue?
This is often used, anybody cutting a tree or a handful of trees on their property in the buffer would be an allowable activity, provided they don't remove the stump and that they remove the fallen tree without use of a motorized vehicle. So this seems to work pretty well. I wouldn't touch this.
Okay, copy that.
Does it overlap with the tree code in some fashion?
Yeah, it does a little bit. But so there could be an instance where right now the wetlands ordinance allows you to cut a tree in the buffer or the wetland, so long as you don't remove the stump or use motorized vehicles. If that tree is greater than 100 feet from your house and outside the wetland, you would need a permit from under the tree ordinance.
Okay.
So it does, but there's a separate questionnaire that Kevin uses for the tree removal. It's a little weird. It probably could be better, but I would.
Maybe what we can do is we can add there selective cutting provided stumps are left in place and work is accomplished without assistance, and then just say, but all work must be in accordance with, and then refer to the tree preservation law, right? So that therefore that requires them to take a second look and to make sure that they're not violating that law.
That probably makes sense.
Okay.
Sound good to you, John?
Yeah, I think in some cases the wetland law is a little stronger. In other cases, it's not. So I think changing the wordings to make them work together is probably the right move.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, so I think we need to skip the yellow stuff for now, just in interest of time.
Oh, so if we go back up to the green for a second, I want to.
Sure.
So one of the things that we saw, like, so you talk about in here, it said regulated activity in a wetland proper except as set forth and it refers to a different section of this chapter, including but are not limited to. This was in your definition, and we really felt that it probably made more sense to be here so that all your regulated activities are sort of together, so that if somebody's reviewing it, because if not, they're reading just the regulated activities and not necessarily that definition. And there are a few that seem to, there are some regulated activities that seem to be listed here that weren't listed further down the list of regulated activities. And we just felt that it was just easier maybe for the reader to understand what is regulated. So that's why we moved it down.
Thank
Now,
you.
just be careful that I think the heading of this section is regulated activities where permits are issued by the planning board. There's another one is issued by the wetland inspector. You'd have to repeat the regulated activities again.
Okay. Yeah, and we can, and you know what, and that's one thing, Jan, like that was a little bit, for me, that was a little bit confusing as to what was, because I think I'll take a look to make sure it's clearly distinct, and maybe you and I can kind of follow up on that just to make sure it's clear what's regulated by the planning board and then what's regulated through like the building department.
Happy to do so.
Okay.
That sounds very smart. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we would want to be done ahead of time before the version makes it to the town board and the public. That way, those kind of administrative and like clarity things are just worked out and done. Okay, moving forward. We're gonna, everybody good with everywhere changing the word secretary to administrator? Yeah, I think that's easy enough. I know that our administrators like to be referred to as administrators and not secretaries. I'm going to skip yellow stuff for now. Doesn't mean it's off the table for good. Okay, I think we're almost done, but there are a few more little things hiding down here at the bottom. Okay, I think this might be covered under the administrative changes that Valerie and her team are going to do. Can I ask, once Valerie and her team clean this up with the administrative changes from Jan, then can I think that we all are going to review this again anyway. So Jan, can I ask you and Charlene for the planning board to put a pin in this, but check it after to make sure it reflects correctly? Okay. Because yeah, we want that to be clear that process is actually matching reality. And same here. So if, yeah, I don't think we need to discuss that much. Okay. You guys are all champs for hanging in there. Everybody okay with this? That, let's see. If the inspector finds work to be complete in accordance with permits, provisions, and all fees and fines have been paid, that seems like an important clarification.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Again, almost there. There's just a couple, maybe more green things hiding down here. Nope, we made it to the end. Okay. Okay, so, without going back in again on some of the yellow things, I think some of those the second tier I deemed them to be second priority conversations just in terms of keeping the meeting moving. I think those will probably come out in sort of the next versions and the next revisions. So if it's okay to move on, and come back to some of the bigger discussions that Valerie wanted guidance on before she moves to the next round. I feel like that's okay for everybody. Okay, awesome. And remember, if you have any questions or thoughts or something that we didn't address that you want to address, please write it down and send me an email. Okay, so Valerie, I'm gonna let you ask your questions to the group because you need guidance on this before you can move on to the next batches of changes.
Yes. So one of the things I wanted to talk to everybody about was, so you have accessory apartments on the books. However, the accessory apartments kind of refers to it. It basically sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that if you know, you have to be an owner occupy, it requires owner occupancy, but there is an affordable housing component associated with it. So then there seems to be this process in which, you know, you have to verify the incomes of people that live within the accessory apartments. However, there does seem to be some language in this section that also refers to, like, you could have like family members living in there. So it's not really clear as to, I mean, do you require let me just pull the section up.
So your question is, what actually happens in practice?
Yes.
That way we can figure out if the code is just outdated.
In other words, do we require that one of the units be occupied by an owner?
The accessory apartments is absolutely, one of the units is occupied by the owner. This used to be a special use permit requirement, and then a number of years ago, the town board revised it so you just get the accessory apartment permit through the building department. I don't believe that there's a requirement that it be affordable.
So here's where it comes in. Administration, the Housing Committee and Housing Administration shall monitor middle income and affordable housing units and the accessory apartments. And then it has the specifically the Housing Committee and Housing Administrator shall be responsible for, and then it has all of this, right? But it doesn't seem to be that in practice that that's the case. And so I'm wondering if
I think that was sort of a disconnect when the town began to implement AFFH requirements, and the kind of standard accessory apartments kind of got mixed. That needs to be looked at to get cleaned up.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Because that's what I was sort of sensing, and that was one of the things that, okay.
Yeah, I think it existed before the newer, you know, Westchester requirements and definitions came in. This was there. I think the Housing Committee is no longer involved in all this. I mean, I think it's.
Yeah, I just got a text from Kirsten. We no longer have a housing administration. This was taken over by Westchester County.
Okay, so I think we need to clean this up and just make it an accessory apartments law. Because I think that is potentially something that becomes like a hurdle. And Jan, that's good to hear that it's technically not a special permit use, because I think there is still some remnant text in the zoning chapter that refers to it as a special permit use. So I'm going to highlight that as well.
Yep.
Okay. And then the other question I had was accessory residence dwellings.
That's just a second home on a large lot.
Okay, so that was another thing, because in the accessory apartments, it does refer to, like, you could use like garages, for example, but a garage could be a standalone structure. So this is specifically for a standalone dwelling unit, not in an associated like accessory structure.
The accessory resident, you can literally have two single family homes on one lot, so long as it's
Right.
20 acres or greater and meets the other.
Right. Now, that was my one question for this group, because it has 20 acres or greater. But then yet it says, well, it just needs to meet like the bulk requirements of the zoning district. So, you know, in terms of one of the things with the goals and objectives that, you know, people are looking to try to be able to come with like more creative ways to allow for housing, but keeping in character with the community. So what are your thoughts if we suggest reducing this, but you still have to maintain the same bulk requirements of that zoning district? So you don't necessarily have to have 20 acres, but you know, even if you reduce it, I mean, you could even reduce it down to like, you know, twice the amount of, you know, the residential zoning district requirements.
Before Charlene, I want to just put Dan on the spot as the liaison to the housing committee. I know that the housing committee did reach out at one point during the process and say they were going to use Dan as the liaison for them and for the liaison for the steering committee to kind of convey their thoughts about what they had been seeing, what they would like to see. Do you have any insight from that, Dan? Or maybe you think
Not on this one.
Oh, okay.
You know, discussion of short-term rentals. That's a.
Oh, okay. So yeah, we don't need to go down different. Okay, Charlene, go ahead.
On nobody's radar, I don't think.
Okay. Helpful. Charlene?
This one really stumps me because it's 20 acres, of course, but we have a lot of property that have accessory residence dwelling, you know, and also it's like incidental. I don't really understand the language. Subordinate to the principal and located on the same lot. So subordinate, how subordinate to the principal detached one family.
Right. And well, I mean, it does have a maximum, I think, of like, it shall not exceed 1,500 square feet. So it's a small unit. So to have 20 for 20 acres,
Right.
I mean, I just thought like, you know, that just seems, I mean, at least if you're trying to have, you know, I understand if it was, you know, if you were talking about like an acre of land, right, you know, and you would say we don't want to reduce it any further, but 20 acres, I mean, you could easily come in for subdivisions and get multiple houses on that property.
And also, but it's also the subordinate aspect of it,
Yeah.
what it means. And secondly, we have bunches of properties that have accessory residence dwellings, bunches.
Right.
And we also have property that it's one lot and we have 3 houses, although each are on 2 acres. It's just 1 6-acre lot. I know because I have one next door. And, you know, I don't know. And that again is a policy thing. And maybe I would ask Robin to see if, you know, he's had a lot of requests for zoning issues on that, on stuff like that.
Because I know you had about 94, I think there was like about 90 something accessory apartments. And so I was just curious, because if this isn't even being used, then maybe, you know, in a number of communities now, they are allowing for the separate dwelling on larger lots, but maybe you don't need 20 acres to do that.
Robin, do you want to comment? You have to unmute yourself. Or if you don't, that's okay. Oh, just unmute yourself. We can't hear you. Not yet. There you go.
How about now? Okay.
Yeah.
We get very few applications for accessory dwellings. As you were discussing earlier, the accessory apartments, we don't look at those applications anymore. They go right through the building department. But the accessory dwellings, we get one now and then, but not many. And one of the reasons probably is the restrictions on it are only 1,500 square feet and 2 bedrooms. So it's not like you can build another 6-bedroom house on your lot, even if you have 20 acres.
That's
Right.
That answers
So
the
why
question.
don't we consider, if it seems to be that the consensus is that maybe this can be looked at and maybe we can tweak it. Not necessarily trying to say we're gonna, encourage a lot of like new, individual single family homes popping up on lots, but maybe take a look at it to really allow that smaller dwelling unit on larger properties, but you don't necessarily have to have 20 acres for that to be considered.
Oh, yes, I think that's a great idea to look at that. Maybe you could cut the size down. Maybe you can get a few more to help with the housing in town.
Right.
Definitely something.
Okay.
more.
great.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, what's your next one?
The EV charging station. So it sounds like, so I wanted to see how, like, so right now the zoning code is silent to EV charging stations. And so I wanted to see how that's being already handled in the town, because we can easily then just incorporate it as to, if it hasn't been handled yet and you haven't really been dealing with it yet, then I'm going to say it's probably coming. And maybe we should consider just, acknowledging that the EV charging stations are, that they're permissible, but they would be, you would have to have them in like a regular, like a parking lot, and it would just be in a normal parking space, unless for some reason there's certain objections to that. And Jan and Jan, I think you both have thoughts, so I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so I'll defer to Jan, but basically these all happen in commercial areas, so we handle it as a site plan change, but Jan will tell you more.
Okay.
Yeah, I think on the residential end, it's allowed as an accessory and, by issuance of a building permit. And then as Jan stated, we have approved a bunch of them. And we allow them subject to site plan approval.
Okay. So maybe I can add them as like, we can add them as an accessory use for both in the residential districts and the in the non-residential districts, the business districts.
Yeah, maybe to both, just so it's we've been processing them, but if it's in the code, it's even better just to have
Okay.
as accessory use in all the districts.
Okay.
John?
Yeah, well, as the owner of an electric car, what if somebody wanted to just build a lot that was nothing but charging stations, so it's not part of an existing parking area?
Right. So that's right. And that's something that we can add in as like, I think that goes back to maybe Jan's comment with like a service station. So that's something that could be, identified as a separate use. But for the most part, I think so far the way electric charging stations have been installed, I feel like that is going to be less and less of a situation that's going to take place. I think you might see them popping up at like gas stations, already existing, as opposed to having a standalone, because it's so easy there's already an excessive amount of parking spaces already have been developed throughout like the county or even the state, that I think they're just going to continue using existing parking stalls as opposed to creating new ones. But we can absolutely look at that as a standalone use if you'd like.
You can't have a parking lot without a primary use, so it would definitely have to be categorized separately if you're looking to do something like that.
Charlene?
Well, I don't think it's applicable right here, but we should look to the sizes of the spaces. Only because we had one case that they had to make it a certain size, and you don't really need that size. You can make it a little smaller for various reasons. Jan, do you remember that situation?
Yes, but not the details. But the other thing I was going to say is, well, if we're going to talk about EV charging, I would love to see the requirement for any new or changes to a commercial lot to require some percentage of EV chargers as a, that's the way the future's going. So anytime somebody updates a lot, we should have a requirement that we have I don't know what it is. I mean, Richfield just put in one that had, I want to say something like, anytime you have a lot with 20 spaces, you have to have at least 3 EV chargers, something. There's some ratio that makes sense. And I think going forward, it's just foolish if we don't require that.
And you have to define them because a level 1 EV charger is a plug in the wall, so.
Right, no, it would have to be level 2, but the other thing is, so to go back to the gasoline service station, I think what I was really just trying to say is maybe we should call it service station instead of gasoline. And that was really the big thing I was going to do, is just try to say it's gotta allow for mechanics to work on a car that doesn't have gas in it, you know, because there might be, you know, you might need brakes, you might need steering fluid, I don't know. So that was that. But while I have the chance to say the floor, I really think we need to have, if you're working on a commercial parking lot in some way, it should be upgraded to have a certain number of electric chargers, level 2 or more.
Okay, Dan?
Yeah, I chatted the nice sort of page, which is like encouraging using your codes to, you know, to promote and allow for charging. So I'm sure that's something we want to review and make sure we're grabbing best practices and everything.
Okay, great. Charlene?
If we're looking to change it to service stations, we have to realize that we do not allow any more service stations than there are now.
Mm.
So if you know, once you do that, and the reason that we don't allow any more gasoline stations, from what I gather, is that, you know, because of the pollution. Is there pollution with the electric cars? I don't know how to answer that, but I think it should be looked at as what the interaction between a service station and a gas station, and if there should be different definitions.
Okay. John?
Yeah, I don't think you want to call the electric charging service stations. It's confusing. Look, if you need your electric car serviced, you take it to the dealer or a regular service station. I think we want to keep the charging thing separate.
Okay.
And I think that makes it easier to get them in, and it doesn't run afoul of our regulations. So,
Okay, this is all very helpful context for Valerie.
I mean, we just had what, 4 or 6 of them put up in Golden's Bridge. I don't know if they're running yet, but they're installed.
Dan?
Just going to suggest, you know, car repair shops as opposed to, you know, just to distinguish that they don't actually supply fuel.
Yeah, there's different definitions in terms of like vehicle repair or general, you know, we can bring in, and that's like the next round, we're actually going to start taking a look at like your uses and what's permitted, what's not permitted, and maybe make some suggestions based upon the goals and objectives.
Okay. Charlene, do you have another question? Okay. Were there any other topics you needed input on, Valerie?
Yeah, the last one, there's just one more, and it deals with your, so in your non-residential zoning districts, you allow for residential units, right? And I know this was something that you undertook recently. The minimum lot areas, though, I just wanted to raise this. So in the they're allowed on, that requires for the MF zoning districts, it requires 15 acres. And then it says, but in the CC20, SU, RB, and GB zoning districts, which are your business districts, it says in which case the minimum gross lot area shall be 5 acres. So I think what I wanted to raise with this is it prevents that kind of, like in your hamlet areas, especially your downtown hamlet areas. Yes, you do have some of your larger shopping districts, but you also have some smaller, like non-resident businesses that potentially could add like a dwelling unit or 2 on their site, but they don't have 5 acres. And I didn't know if there was a history to that as to why the 5 acres was determined versus maybe allowing a little bit more organically having the development of those residential units in the business district. Dan?
Yeah, I would just say the first thing that came to mind is the discussion around investigating whether the east lot on the and Golden's Bridge could be modified to include housing and still have parking and everything, and like, so there's an active, and that's clearly not 5 acres there, I don't believe. So yeah, this sounds like it could be limiting.
You can still have requirements for like, you can still have requirements for parking, you can still have requirements for like, clearly if you can't hook up to a sewer, you need to have septic, right? So all those things will kind of constrain like how small or what you can possibly do that under, but you might be able to get like a unit here, a unit there on some of your like, you know, and everybody, I think everybody has embraced this concept because I heard it throughout the community process that when we raised the issue with the business districts looking at it, everyone's like, but we allow it. And I said, well, you do, but you know, there are clearly constraints in terms of how large of a property you need in order to even be able to consider that. So I wanted to kind of float that with this committee that we might come back with suggesting maybe reducing that a bit. Okay. All right, that was it.
Did you have a question, Charlene? Oh, you're on mute.
Just an observation, and there's a couple of places that would lend themselves to that, but they're on 35, and it's already a horror scene getting in and out of. So I like the idea of restrictions, you know, as to the parking and, you know, the ingress and egress, and the ability to ingress and egress.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because it'd be dangerous to have a whole bunch more places, but it's a really good idea.
That all the input direction you need on those topics?
That's what I need for now. I'm sure there'll be more coming up next month.
Okay.
So
Great.
if it's all right with you, I will send the definitions of family to Judd, and the telecommunication stuff I'll take a look at. For excavation of fill and steep slopes, I'll work on standalone chapters for like everybody to review. And then in terms of the wetlands stuff and the wetlands revisions, I'm going to work into Jan's suggestions, and I'll probably circle back with Jan just to make sure that I'm capturing it correctly in terms of how the administrative process and how the approval process runs. Okay.
Great. That all sounds great.
Great.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Before we adjourn, I just want to remind everybody about meeting dates, and this is shifting a little bit from what we've talked about before. So if you can mark your calendars for November 20th for the next zoning committee meeting, and then December 18th for the next comprehensive plan steering committee meeting. We want to add in another zoning committee meeting either on December 14th or December 18th. On the 18th, it would be back to back. So I'm just wondering, would the 14th be okay? Does anybody have a conflict on the December 14th? Okay, you do, Rose? Okay. But one out of the group is, I think, okay. I don't think we're going to be able to get everybody in December. Okay, so we can circle back on that, but I think that's a good schedule for now. Please watch your email accounts. We'll be doing a lot of work between now and the next meeting just to make sure things are moving forward. Dan, you can remind your fellow town board members that they're looped in this whole process. They've had access to the Google Drive folder, and they'll be able to see all the different versions as we go forward. But I'm trying to stay in touch with them via email just so it's crystal clear what's going on and there are zero surprises for them when this ultimately makes its way to the desk for final approval.
And Katie, it would be helpful maybe so there's no confusion that when we update the chapters, like either remove the older versions
Absolutely.
or, yeah, okay,
Yeah, I'll just upload them as new versions to the same link so that when people click on
Perfect.
it, it
Okay.
goes back to what they're expecting to see.
okay, great.
Okay, let me just make sure I didn't miss anything else. I think we're good. Okay, thanks for staying a little late, everybody. Really appreciate it. It is a little bit of a bummer for me that we couldn't get it done by 9, but I think next time I'm gonna set the agenda to let's just say 7:30 to 9:30. Is that okay with everybody? Okay, then we won't be so stressed about time. All right, thank you so much. Thanks for anyone who's still listening on YouTube. Really appreciate it. And yeah, just can't thank everybody enough. The group here, everybody involved in the project. It's a doozy and we're making our way through. So thank you so much. And I will officially a motion to adjourn the meeting. Seconded by John. All in favor? Aye, everybody. Okay, thank you so much. Have a great night.